My mother-in-law invited my fiancé's ex to our wedding and he dumped me at the altar for her, so I left him in despair by exposing his darkest secrets online. So, I, 30 female, was supposed to get married to my ex-fiancé Scott, 32 male, 5 years ago, but that didn't happen. He dumped me on the day of our wedding for his ex-girlfriend Ruby, 32 female. Scott and I had been together for about 2 years before he proposed, and I said yes. Then there were 6 months of planning, and finally our wedding day. So we were together for 2.5 years, but he still decided to change his mind about the wedding at the very last moment when Ruby arrived at the wedding. And no, I didn't invite her, and neither was she on the approved guest list, but she was an addition that my dearest mother-in-law Alice had made. Ruby and Scott shared a long history together, having been in a relationship for a full 7 years before things fell apart. By the time Scott and I began dating, they had already been separated for 2 solid years. He rarely brought her up in conversation, keeping those memories tucked away, and it was only through chatting with his friends that I pieced together the story of why their romance had ended. It all started back in high school. They were both 18, navigating their senior year, when they first fell for each other. Their bond endured the challenges of college life, even with Ruby heading off to an out-of-state university, which meant long-distance calls, weekend visits, and all the emotional ups and downs that come with being apart. Once she finished her degree and came back home, they took the next big step by moving into a cozy apartment together, building a life filled with shared routines, inside jokes, and dreams for the future. But after nearly 7 years of this committed partnership, Scott gathered his courage and proposed marriage, envisioning a lifetime ahead. Sadly, Ruby felt overwhelmed at the idea. She wasn't prepared for such a permanent commitment at that stage in her life, so she gently turned him down. They attempted to salvage what they had, putting in effort to communicate better and reignite the spark, but the rejection had created an irreparable crack. In the end, they chose to go their separate ways, acknowledging that forcing it would only lead to more pain. To make a clean break, Ruby accepted a job opportunity in Canada, relocating far from the city they once called home, effectively closing that chapter. From what I gathered, they cut off all contact after the split, allowing each other space to heal without the complication of lingering ties. As for how Scott and I crossed paths, it traces back to our college days, though our connection was minimal then. I attended the same university, but as his junior, our worlds barely overlapped. I might have seen him in passing at campus events or in shared classes, but we never exchanged more than a casual nod or hello. It wasn't until years later, at a festive Christmas dinner hosted by a mutual coworker, that fate intervened. The atmosphere was lively, with twinkling lights, holiday music, and laughter filling the room, and amid the crowd, Scott and I struck up a conversation that felt effortless and genuine. There was an undeniable spark, a kind of easy chemistry that made the evening fly by. Before long, we decided to slip away from the party, seeking a quieter spot to continue talking without interruptions. We wandered to a nearby cafe, sipping hot cocoa and sharing stories late into the night, discovering common interests and values that drew us closer. That impromptu outing left us both eager for more, so we exchanged numbers and promised to keep in touch. What followed were a few delightful dates, romantic dinners, walks in the park, movie nights, that quickly blossomed into something serious. Within just 3 months, we were officially a couple, committed to exploring this new relationship with open hearts. Our time together stretched over 2 fulfilling years, marked by adventures, deep conversations, and growing affection, culminating in Scott's proposal and our decision to tie the knot. Yet, all that planning and anticipation came crashing down in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. It had been nearly 3 years since Ruby and Scott's breakup, a period I thought had allowed him to fully move on, but she reappeared out of nowhere on what was meant to be our joyous wedding day, shattering everything we had built. The memory of that day remains etched in my mind with vivid clarity, as if it happened yesterday. I had already made my way down the aisle, my heart pounding with excitement, dressed in my dream gown, surrounded by friends and family. We stood together at the altar, the officiant ready to begin, when Scott's expression shifted to one of unease. He leaned in and whispered that, being in a sacred chapel, he couldn't proceed with vows that felt dishonest in his heart. He insisted we needed to discuss something urgent right then and there. The ceremony ground to a halt, guests murmuring in confusion as he pulled me aside to a quiet corner. That's when he dropped the bombshell. His mother, Alice, had taken it upon herself to invite Ruby to the event. He even gestured toward the front row, where I spotted them. Alice, beaming with a self-satisfied smirk, clad in an off-white dress that bordered on bridal territory, as if to subtly undermine my special moment. And there was Ruby, avoiding eye contact, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor, perhaps aware of the chaos her presence was causing. Honestly, Alice's meddling didn't shock me in the least. From the very start of my relationship with Scott, she had been vocal about her disapproval, wearing her disdain like a badge. It stemmed from my personality not aligning with her vision of the perfect daughter-in-law. I wasn't the demure, soft-spoken type who would nod along quietly or suppress my opinions to keep the peace. Instead, I'm outgoing, straightforward, and unapologetically expressive, qualities that clashed with her traditional ideals of sweetness and timidity. She often criticized me for being too loud during family gatherings, too bold in my choices, or too animated in conversations, as if my vibrancy threatened her sense of order. These aren't flaws in my eyes, they're just not the traits she prized. So, it made twisted sense that she'd orchestrate this disruption by inviting Ruby, whom she viewed as a more suitable match, someone quieter, more malleable, who might fit seamlessly into the family dynamic without challenging her authority. By bringing this ideal alternative right to the wedding, Alice aimed to sway her son, making it simpler for her to exert influence over his life decisions in the years ahead. Her actions weren't just petty, they were calculated, designed to prioritize her control over everyone's happiness, including mine. Looking back, it revealed so much about the underlying tensions I had tried to ignore, but in that moment, it felt like a deliberate sabotage of what should have been a celebration of love. Not only did she bring her along, but she also arranged a conversation between Ruby and Scott before I walked down the aisle, which is what he told me about later, using that conversation as a reason to dump me at the altar. He told me that he and Ruby had a chat before this, and she apologized for turning him down all those years ago and explained that she just felt too young and inexperienced to actually make such a huge commitment. But now, after almost 3 years, she'd realized that she'd messed up because she knew she'd never find someone better than him and had come back to ask for one last chance to make their relationship work. That was all it took to undo 2 years of our relationship, and he was back to square one once more. Obviously, back at the time, I tried to argue with him and make him stay, but he told me that it'd be a mistake for us to get married now that he realized that he'd never actually fallen out of love with Ruby and I'd just been a placeholder for the woman that he actually loved. His words stung, but I was too desperate, and I tried to convince him to stay nevertheless. It didn't work, and I knew that it was all futile when he asked me to return the engagement ring. I lost my cool and ended up flinging it to the ground before I walked out and decided to drive myself away from the wedding, all the guests, and just everything to do with Scott. I kept driving until I reached a bed and breakfast a little out of town and stayed there for the next couple of days. Scott paid off all the dues of the wedding organizers and vendors, and thankfully I didn't have to spend any of my hard-earned money except on my dress. The only time we met after that was when I went back home to collect my things after almost 2 weeks of the wedding. He and Ruby were at home at the time and didn't even bother to stop cuddling when I walked in with a friend of mine to pack my stuff up and leave. That's how awful they were, and at the end of the day, I was kind of glad that Scott decided to dump me before we even got married because then we'd have to get divorced eventually whenever Ruby decided that she wanted him back. So they actually saved me a lot of money and heartache. I've tried to move on, and I guess I've done a decent job of it, but I have crazy trust issues now. I had a nicotine addiction a couple of years ago that came along with crippling depression, and I have to go to therapy twice a week now to be a normal functional human being. My mental health has suffered a lot because of those 3, but they've been doing just fine as far as I know. They got married a couple of months after I was dumped, and they even have 2 kids now aged 2 and 4. They're expecting a third as well from what I know. The reason I know all of this is because about 6 months ago I befriended Ella, 28 female, the new receptionist at my company. We discovered that we had a lot in common at a work party and ended up becoming really good friends. One day at lunch, she told me that one of the guys she hooked up with a couple of years ago and still followed on social media was now having a 3rd kid with his wife. I thought it was just harmless gossip, but then she showed me the profile, and it was Scott. I was dumbfounded for a few moments, but Ella went on talking and explained that she'd matched with this guy on a dating app 2 years ago, and apparently he told her that he was in an open marriage, so she'd agreed to go out with him. But now she wasn't so sure if he told her the truth anymore, so I clarified and informed her that in all probability he wasn't in an open marriage at all and had been cheating on his wife because she was pregnant since the timing lined up with Ruby's 2nd pregnancy. I explained my history with Scott to her, and together we went through his and Ruby's social media, which was easy since both of them have public accounts, and confirmed that they'd indeed been together when Ruby was heavily pregnant. I could hardly believe that this guy had first ditched me at the altar for Ruby and now he couldn't even find it in himself to stay loyal to the woman he'd left me for. I was disgusted and felt like it was about time that I got back at him for what he did to me, and thankfully by then Ella was a good friend of mine and agreed to be a part of my plan because of how messed up she'd found Scott's actions to be. She herself felt infuriated that he'd lied to her about being in an open marriage just to get her to sleep with him, and they didn't just hook up a couple of times. It went on for a couple of weeks after their first few dates. She'd followed him on Instagram and found that his wife was heavily pregnant and had confronted him about it, but he told her that Ruby didn't really care since she'd been with a fair few guys in the initial months of her pregnancy too. So Ella continued to hook up with him, but eventually she decided that she didn't want to fool around with Scott anymore since she'd begun to develop feelings for him in spite of the fact that she'd only intended for it to be a meaningless fling with him. They'd text regularly, and he'd flirt with her all the time, but she tried her best to ignore it since she knew this wouldn't lead anywhere because he was already married, and even if it was an open marriage, he wouldn't leave his wife for some woman he'd met on a dating app. So eventually they grew apart but continued to follow each other on social media. When I found out about how Ella and Scott were connected, Ruby was already 4 months pregnant, and Scott had announced it on social media with a post. That's the one that Ella had shown me. After we found out about the connection, Ella and I started putting together all the proof that we had of Scott's infidelity. It took us a couple of days, but we finally had an assortment of screenshots of texts that Scott had sent to Ella over the course of their short-lived fling. He used to flirt with her like nobody's business, would make promises to her and all that jazz. There were also screenshots of him making plans to meet Ella, and several times he'd even suggest that she come over to his house while Ruby was asleep since she's a heavy sleeper and wouldn't wake up for hours. I was disgusted and repulsed that he was doing this behind her back while she was carrying his second child, but that's Scott for you. After that, Ella had the idea to take it up a notch higher, and I think this is where we messed up. The two of us got way too caught up in the revenge, and I think we went a little crazy. When Ruby hit 6 months, Ella and I decided that it was time to test Scott again, so Ella reached out to him yet again. We didn't know what to expect since they hadn't exactly been friends after they stopped talking 2 years back, but Scott still replied, and guess what? He was still flirting with Ella and was even reminiscing about their past because Ruby was pregnant again, and she was even moodier than her previous pregnancies and was bigger too. He told Ella that she'd picked the perfect time to get back in touch with him, indicating that he was willing to cheat on Ruby yet again. We texted him for a few days and gathered a couple more screenshots, but then left him hanging after a while. Finally, 2 weeks ago, Scott posted that Ruby had finally given birth to a daughter, and within 3 days of that, Ella and I posted all the evidence we had on Facebook and tagged everyone who knew the two of them. That started a total social media crapfest, but I turned the notifications off for that post and waited for either Scott or Ruby to reach out to me or Ella. It finally happened 2 days after we posted, and Scott was the one who contacted me. I blocked him everywhere after we broke up 5 years back, but I'd unblocked him just so that I'd be able to see what he had to say about me, finally exposing him for the jerk that he really is. He sent me a long rant about how I'd ruined his life and that now Ruby was threatening to leave him just because of what Ella and I had posted. He accused me of being a psychotic stalker and said that he'd take me to court if Ruby divorced him, which is not even possible because he doesn't have a case against me or Ella. He's the one who cheated first and then tried to cheat yet again quite shamelessly. There were a lot of other things that he said, but it was mostly name-calling and accusing me of ruining his life. I was really satisfied with what I'd done because from what I understood, he would soon be facing a divorce and quite possibly a custody battle as well, and he deserved every bit of it in my opinion. Unfortunately, my friends don't share the same sentiment. They think I went too far, especially because Ruby was pregnant, and they believe that because it had been 5 whole years since our breakup, I should have just let sleeping dogs lie instead of pulling some crazy stunt on social media just for revenge like we were still in high school. I don't think that's fair because Scott literally ruined any future relationship that I could have had with what he did. He ditched me at the altar for his ex-girlfriend after we dated for 2 years, and I don't think any of my friends understand how awful that felt. I spent years trying to move on, and I think I was totally normal for a while too until I met Ella. She's the one who told me that Scott had been cheating, and that's what pushed me over the edge. He'd abandoned me for Ruby, and now he wasn't even loyal to her, but for whatever reason, my friends believed that I was the one who messed up here and thought that I owed them both an apology for trying to ruin their marriage after 5 years. I don't understand how I ruined their marriage because all I did was put the truth out in public. The cheating was all on Scott, not me. Ella doesn't think we did anything wrong, but of course she'd say that because she was a part of this as well. I don't understand how I'm in the wrong here. So, Ida for exposing my ex-fiancé for cheating on his pregnant wife twice in a row after he left me at the altar 5 years ago? Scott abandoned me at the altar 5 years ago to be with Ruby, and then he lied to Ella about being in an open marriage while Ruby was heavily pregnant just to hook up with her. I just exposed him for what he was doing. Yeah, I chose to do it at a time that would be the most hurtful for both Ruby and Scott, but that's because they chose to hurt me 5 years back. So why shouldn't I try to get back at them? I tried being the bigger person and had let it all go, but the universe brought me back into his life some way or the other, just not for a good reason. I don't think I did anything wrong, and if anything, my friends should be talking about Scott being the bad guy instead of putting me down. But I don't think that's ever going to happen because my friends continued to remain friends with him even after he broke up with me on the day of our wedding. So that should have been enough for me to realize that these people never were my friends in the first place, but I guess I was too delusional to believe it at the time. I get it now though and have decided to cut them all off. I don't need them, and I'm quite sure I'm better off without such negative people in my life anyway. As for Ella, there was an unprecedented amount of hate for her because of the things she'd done, and I'd just like to take a moment to explain that she didn't have any idea that Scott wasn't in an open marriage back when she'd been going out with him. He'd convinced her that he was in an open marriage, and at that point he had very few pictures of Ruby on his profile, so it wasn't that hard for her to believe him. Trust me when I say this, she's really not the kind of woman who would hook up with a married man unless she knew that their partner had agreed to it. She's adventurous, but that doesn't make her immoral or whatever. The one thing that I'll concede she did wrong was that she didn't tell Ruby when she started suspecting that maybe Scott wasn't telling the truth about being in an open marriage, but she was too skeptical to talk about it to a woman she barely even knew, and a pregnant woman at that. So she decided to remove herself from the situation entirely and stop talking to Scott. She's been a good friend to me, and I think even if she had messed up back then, I don't think I'm going to judge her by that because she's genuinely been there for me. So maybe I'm a little biased and in her favor. Nobody's perfect, but we're all trying, and Ella is actually a nice person. So please don't judge her based on the original post. There's a lot more to her as a person, I can promise you that. Now coming to Scott and Ruby, from what I've heard, they're still fighting, and Ruby has actually been living with her parents for a few days. I still have 2 friends who are actually on my side, and they're keeping me in the loop since they have some friends in common with Ruby. It's been a week since my original post, and they still haven't managed to resolve the situation as far as I know. If Ruby has even an ounce of dignity left, she'll walk out of that marriage just like I walked out of my wedding, but you never know. These are pretty messed up people that we're talking about here, so there's no telling what they might or might not do. But I know what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to sit back, relax, and enjoy the drama with popcorn. Okay, so you guys remember Alice, right? Alice, my almost mother-in-law, actually arranged the conversation between Scott and Ruby which ended up destroying my relationship. Yeah, her. Today Alice contacted me, and she was nice to me today, which made sense because she wanted me to help her out by deleting the post I'd made. She got a hold of my number from Scott and called me to ask me in her most tearful voice to delete the post and talk to Ruby so that she'd come back to him because she couldn't afford to lose her 3 grandchildren. Ruby's furious and has been threatening to file for divorce and full custody of the kids with no visitation rights, and the only way to avoid that is if Scott agrees to transfer the ownership of the house to her. I don't understand why Scott isn't willing to do something so easy, and I'm not even going to try and understand why Ruby is still willing to stay no matter what conditions she puts forth. It's just crazy, but I'm not interested in being part of their craziness. So I told Alice that while I'd love to help the people who ruined my life and mental health, I just don't think there's any point in deleting the post because everyone knows the truth now, and I'd never speak to Ruby, not even if I was offered $10,000, because that's the woman who had no shame meddling in a relationship but is now mad that someone else did the same thing to her. She should have known better, and she should have known that if Scott could be shallow enough to dump me in a single day just because she was back, he wouldn't hesitate before dumping her for someone else either. Anyway, I told Alice that I wasn't going to lift even a finger to help them out, and they could figure this out on their own, which is what they left me to do after I got dumped on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. It was so incredibly satisfying to disconnect the call in the middle of her sentence and then block her to make sure she couldn't contact me anymore. I don't care what people say. Honestly, a lot of folks here and even in the real world have said that I'm living in the past, but this feels like I'm finally getting closure, and I can actually start to move on from Scott, Ruby, and Alice. I've been busy with work because I just started working on a new project, and it's been kind of stressful, so I forgot about this post if I'm being honest. There's not much to say honestly because after I told Alice that I wasn't taking that post down, they didn't contact me any further. What I do know however is that now Scott and Ruby are getting divorced and are fighting over who gets to keep the house and the settlement. They're also in a custody battle because apparently Ruby had demanded full custody of her kids with support and only supervised visits once a month. Ella and I have had a good laugh over this because the guy really has nobody else to blame at this point apart from himself. Obviously he had every chance to wake up and become a decent guy after he left me and fully committed to Ruby, which shouldn't have been hard because they dated for 7 years already. I'm guessing he cheated on her then as well, so this is probably nothing new for him. Come to think of it, he must have been cheating on me too, but I never found out about it. This just proves that life always does come full circle because they're the ones suffering now, and I'm the one doing way better than I was in every aspect, mentally, physically, and definitely financially. I did what I had to do, and I got my closure. I'm going to wish them nothing but good luck for the future now because I think that they're going to need it.